interestingly, my own view on this is slightly heterodox when it comes to corruption. I don't think corruption itself, the scale of corruption, funnily enough, is a problem. I don't think it's a good thing. It's not very pleasant, but it's not so much the quantity of corruption as the quality. I mean, the American political system has had an innovative way of dealing with corruption, which is to legalize it, to regulate it. So, I mean, the lobby industry operates what is a massive kickback scheme. Politician after politician, president after president will sort of implement policies which benefit powerful interests. And then when they finish their presidencies are given directorships on the boards of these corporations, they do very well for themselves. I mean, Bill Clinton was bankrupt when he left the White House. He's now worth something like $600 million. The fundamental problem that not just Britain, but most Western countries have, and I'll explain what I mean by this, is that they become too rich. Many times I would be in meetings where, a famous economist would be advising a prime minister, and the prime minister would listen, and the prime minister, who might only have a bachelor's degree, no economics education, would say that will never work.
Well, Professor John Rapley, thank you so much for finding the time this morning to chat with me all the way from Johannesburg.
Been a pleasure to be with you.
Is it 9 o'clock where you are? It's 10 o'clock, is it?
It's it's just gone 11.
Just
so
gone 11.
2 hours
oh,
ahead
you're 2
this
hours.
time of year. Yeah, we're an hour ahead in the summer of London. 2 hours ahead in the winter because we don't have daylight saving time. So that's why we don't make the summer adjustment.
That makes sense. I'd never thought of that. There we go. I'm learning already. Well, look. The first question I've got for you, John. I think it's not an easy one in a few different ways. It's not an easy one, but I've done some work that involves looking at human development in indices as it happens, because I've been relating it to degrees of sexual dimorphism in men and women. Anyway. So I'm not an HDI expert, but I've looked at those data. One of the things I've noticed about HDI in passing is that, very pleasingly, pretty much year on year, certainly decade on decade, the Human Development Index for countries increases, suggesting that countries are improving. So the Human Development Index has got a blend of sort of education levels, health levels, and sort of economic levels. And I don't think it can be gamed. It's marginally subjective, but I don't think it can particularly be gamed. So across the world, decade on decade, countries are arguably improving. Nonetheless, I think you'll be very aware, because of your extensive travels in what we now call the global south. I think you've travelled and indeed lived in a number of countries for a couple of decades previously. You'll be aware that some countries have been developing better than others, and there are many that are sort of stuck in ruts to some degree. Are there broad patterns that you perceived about why some countries get stuck in a rut and other countries are able to progress fairly quickly? What are those patterns that describe the thus far the winners and losers?
It's a very good question, Lewis, and I must say this is something I have been spending a lot of time thinking about, is the whole measurement of development. And I think it's the first thing I would say is that what do we mean by human development? Because you're right, and in terms of objective indicators, the world just gets better and better and better. But one of the things that has been very kind of distressing, I think, to economists in the last few years is this phenomenon of societies, and this is particularly prominent in Western societies, where objectively conditions are getting better, but subjectively people say they're getting worse. They're voting for anti-system politicians who say the whole thing is a mess, I'm going to burn it to the ground and start over. And trying to account for this, and the response, the inclination among economists is to just say, well, the people are wrong. They just have to be educated that they're actually doing better, that it's not as bad as they think. But I think we have to also entertain the possibility that we have biased our understanding of development by the measurements we have chosen to use, and we may not be capturing the full spectrum of what human development is. So that's the first question I'd say, is this whole question of, having lived and worked in different societies, can you say that, being richer means you're always going to be happier? And I would say, it gets complicated. It gets quite complicated, and it's not. It is something I think that will be a fertile field in the coming years, which is going to be this whole question of, have the measures that have been useful to us so far of human development, are they actually capturing the full picture, or have we been missing something? And have we been, when we get discordant data, like survey data of people saying things are terrible, do we just write it out saying, well, they're wrong, period? It's not, there's no objective indicators. In terms of success and failure, I mean, that is, I would say, I mean, fundamentally, I'm of the view that an awful lot comes down to policy. It's to choices by governments, that you have good governments and you have bad governments, and you have bad governments choose bad policies and good governments choose better policies. I think the kind of broad brush arguments about, well, developing countries were, for the most part, former colonies, and therefore their development is blocked. I think that was a useful kind of way to sort of look at the world 30, 40 years ago, to understand the legacy that they had inherited from colonialism. But it became in some minds rather ossified. This explains everything. The problem is this: they have to emancipate themselves from the world economy in order to be able to develop. And it's much more complicated, because you get countries, I mean, if you go back to 1960, Ghana had a higher per capita income than South Korea. Ghana is much richer in natural resources. Ghana, on paper, looked to have a much brighter future than South Korea. South Korea today is a developed economy, and Ghana is, albeit, it is growing now. It's doing relatively well, but it's nothing. It's simply not in the league of South Korea, and that came down to very poor choices. Now, one could say that the conditions would have favored Korea over Ghana for various reasons. That you had a long history of continuity of a state, and so a strong sense of national identity, which made it possible to ask or simply demand the population make sacrifices in the short term for long-term development in a way that was much harder to do in Ghana. But nevertheless, it did come down. I mean, within Africa, there's a huge variety of experience. I mean, you have some very dynamic countries, and you have some which are doing very badly, and some of the worst in the world. But then some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. And in fact, I would say that one of the big mistakes that still persists in an awful lot of Western writing about Africa, including by very progressive, enlightened people, is to sort of treat Africa as an entity. I mean, it has 55 countries, it has over 1,000 languages, it's massive complexity. It has all sorts of different climate zones, different colonial histories, and in a few cases, no colonial history to speak of. And so to sort of say, as happens, the Bono Geldof or Jeffrey Sachs approach to the world, that Africa is, being held back by this, and it is simply wrong. I mean, some countries in Africa are powering ahead at a phenomenal rate. And others are going backwards. And understanding that complexity, well, why is it? I think you can say, I think one thing we're getting a better understanding, we are getting a better understanding of the role of geography. That certain, nothing is insurmountable, but it is true that certain geographies are more favorable to development than others. Europe, has a very favorable, or had historically, a very favorable geography. It had a high ratio of river to land mass, navigable waterway to land mass, which made trade possible, which made it, it meant that you could have a higher volume of output over time, more complementarities. Whereas in Africa, you get a much lower ratio, and moreover, most of the rivers, much of Africa is on a plateau, which means that as you approach the coast, you have these waterfalls or cataracts, which effectively mean you can't actually navigate all to the way to the coast without making very expensive infrastructure investments. So the result is there was a lot less, and still is much less, trade within the continent, and that oriented, production to the outside world. But as they say, that doesn't mean it's insurmountable. You can, with good choices, with good policies, with very good, and leadership is critical, with good leadership, you can overcome these obstacles. So
John,
I think at the end of the day, it comes down to that.
Sorry, John, that's big pardon. That's my suspicion. I don't want to cut you off in full stride there, because you know so much about these things. But I wonder, that's my suspicion. Tell me if I'm wrong here. That if you get good leadership, things move in the right direction, and these big geographical barriers to some degree are surmountable. I mean, you would never expect Russia to be as rich as the United States because half of Russia is under ice and it's sort of in the corner of the world and it doesn't have access to. It does a bit have access to warm waters, of course, but it tends not just geographically disadvantaged relative to somewhere like the United States. But South Korea, the example you give, of course, has had tremendous disadvantages. In the 19 until about the 1950s, it was basically paddy fields, I think. And then, of course, it was annexed, and it has an aggressive major power just to its north, with obviously North Korea, its own country was severed in two and so forth, and yet it's got a GDP which is commensurate with at least Eastern Europe, if not now Western Europe. Singapore would be another example in quite a different way. Are there high levels of corruption? Of course, it will vary the degree. I know very little about this, so this really is a question for you, not a rhetorical question. Are there high levels of corruption broadly speaking, across Africa, no doubt varying between countries, but are the levels typically quite a lot higher than, say, in Europe?
Um, Interestingly, my own view on this is slightly heterodox when it comes to corruption. I don't think corruption itself, the scale of corruption, funnily enough, is a problem. I don't think it's a good thing. It's not very pleasant, but it's not so much the quantity of corruption as the quality. So, for example, you mentioned South Korea. South Korea, during its rapid industrialization phase, was phenomenally corrupt, and it remained so well into, even into the democratic period. And this came to light, when there was that earthquake and all these buildings collapsed, and it turned out that developers were just paying, under the table to not act to abide by building standards, and there was massive loss of life. Um, but the difference between the kind of corruption, for example, that you see in South Korea and what you see in Nigeria, in African countries, by and large, and this is where South Africa has an interesting history. In African countries, by and large, corruption goes heavily into consumption. So a public official who's on the take is going to use it to buy imported clothing, luxury goods from Prada, Mercedes-Benz. Most of it is leaving the country, and they're going to bank it in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands or the Channel Islands or someplace like that. What they aren't doing is building local business enterprises because they're vulnerable. Because, of course, if you end up sort of falling from grace, your assets can be seized. That's exactly why you want to have them in Swiss bank accounts. In Korea, the deal, essentially the quid pro quo between the governments and the chaebol, was that we will allow you to have beneficial access to public resources to enrich yourself, but in return, you have to build a company here, and you have to employ people here, and you have to, so you will get richer than everyone else, but you can't actually start, shipping your money abroad. And so it was really, is the corruption, and when I say South Africa is interesting is because you get a complaint today among many South Africans who are nostalgic for apartheid that it was less corrupt under the old apartheid regime. Well, that's not true. It was terribly corrupt. But again, the difference was that you were given favorable treatment by the government in return for building a business enterprise that was sustainable. Whereas since 1994, there isn't the pressure to do that. An awful lot of the money that is leaving public accounts is going into foreign bank accounts. It's lining pockets. You see it in the nightclubs in Sandton here in Johannesburg. Very expensive designer labels, and notoriously one of the politicians who likes to wash his hands in expensive rare whiskey just to show how wealthy he is. But he's not actually building. He has been involved in business. I'm not going to call names, but any South Africans in your audience will know who I'm talking about. He has been involved in businesses. By and large, they fail. He's not. He's not his interest. So I think this is a misplaced focus, and so speaking of European history, or a better example perhaps is American history. Um, um, you know, they have themselves histories of corruption, particularly in the U.S. Um, cities like New York were essentially run in large measure. Public works was run by the mafia really up until the time of the mayoralty of Rudy Giuliani, and the old joke that was said at the time is it takes a Sicilian to catch a Sicilian, that he was the mayor who knew how to root out corruption because he could stay one step ahead of the mafia. He would anticipate what they were going to do. I think that's a bit of a cliche, but it's something Italian Americans will say. Chicago, the same thing. Chicago was famously in the 1960s, under the Daley family was extremely corrupt. And this is true. I grew up in Canada, and I can remember, driving in rural Quebec on these rickety country roads where your car would be bumping along, and in the middle of nowhere, you'd open out into a 4-lane, beautiful highway without a car on it, but you'd speed along for about 7 or 8 kilometers, and then you'd go back to the rickety bumpy road, and this was, of course, you just driven through the Liberal MP's constituency. That was how they ran things.
So
I
even
think
Canada's being corrupt.
no,
Wow.
absolutely, absolutely. So I think there is this sort of what tends to happen as an economy becomes more developed, the opportunity cost of this corruption rises, to use economic terms, and it starts to become a bit of a dead weight, and so and civil society becomes more organized. So there is more of a campaign, and this is what's happening in South Africa. There's more of a campaign against it. It becomes harder to engage in over time. But to sort of take the view and say, well, Britain is so much less corrupt than Nigeria, you're comparing apples and oranges. You have to compare Britain in the 19th century to Nigeria today, to get a more accurate
And
sense.
you would say that Britain in the 19th century was pretty corrupt, but
You didn't have to
nonetheless
look
was able
far.
to
Yeah,
develop extremely rapidly. So
right.
corruption doesn't necessarily curtail or heavily curtail the opportunities of a country to develop if other things are working well for that nation.
And if it's the character of corruption, Lewis, I think what I'm trying to
Okay.
get at is
Yeah.
it's not whether or not you're sort of siphoning money off, but what you're doing with the money you siphon off. And I think that's the key difference. And I think that's underappreciated. There is this strong kind of moralistic element to a lot of the literature on corruption because it isn't pleasant. It just seems, and I think is unfair, but the question is simply because something is unfair, does that necessarily make it economically inefficient? And I think that's a mistake, a big mistake. I mean, and an awful lot of economists make that mistake as well because of this assumption that fundamentally the market economy is a moral system. There's this idea that, well, if you do it by market logic, it's going to be fair. But that simply isn't, that's a non sequitur. And so I don't think we should be transposing a moral narrative onto what is one concerning economic
Well,
efficiency.
and indeed, often is it not the case that the populations, that the voters don't necessarily mind that much if their politicians are somewhat corrupt, if they see that their own lives are progressing. In many countries, maybe all countries, they expect politicians to be somewhat corrupt because they're politicians after all and they're climbers and they want to get to the top of a hierarchy and they like power. Okay, so they'll suffer that to some degree, they'll accept it to some degree if those politicians nonetheless seem to be doing a good job in terms of broad policy.
Absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the American political system, I mean, the American political system has had an innovative way of dealing with corruption, which is to legalize it, to regulate it. So, I mean, the lobby industry operates what is a massive kickback scheme. Politician after politician, president after president will sort of implement policies which benefit powerful interests. And then when they finish their presidencies are given directorships on the boards of these corporations. They do very well for themselves. I mean, Bill Clinton was bankrupt when he left the White House. He's now worth something like $600 million. It wasn't because he's just given an awful lot of speeches or writing books that were bestsellers. He was able to sort of form, the first thing Barack Obama did when he left office is give a speech to Goldman Sachs for which he was paid $600,000 for an hour. Well, Goldman Sachs did very well off his presidency. And you look at the Trump presidency. I mean, it's spectacularly corrupt. I mean, it's just so obvious the way he's using his influence in order to build his family enterprise. His own followers know that. They don't hold that against him if, as was the case in his first term, they feel, and with some evidence that their lives are improving. The difference in his second term is that he's doing this, but their own lives are not actually keeping up, and they've sensed that in other words, there isn't this expectation that we all have to live the same way. I think in any political regime, there's a tolerance of inequality. There's a tolerance of the people in power using power to advance themselves. The expectation is they will also use it to advance their followers. And if they're not doing that, that social contract breaks down. That's where it becomes a problem. There is an interesting literature, on corruption in Africa, French literature, which says that corruption historically in the most corrupt countries in Africa, there was what today the Democratic Republic of Congo used to be called Zaire. Zaire was a spectacularly corrupt country. Nothing could be done involving a public sector or the police without some kind of payment of bribes. And and yet the interesting argument that was made in this literature is this was not because of the failure of politicians. This was driven from below. This was people. In fact, there's a beautiful book I would recommend to any of your students. It's a short novel by Chinua Achebe called No Longer at Ease, about this in the early post-colonial period, someone who sort of comes back from Oxford. The village has pooled their money to put him through school, and he's come back and got a job in the civil service filled with these ideas, British civil service, of public service, of being impartial and not discriminating in favor. But of course, the whole village is at his office, lining up at his office each day. There's new supplicants from the village saying, well, we pooled our funds to put you through school. What are you going to do for us? And he comes under intense pressure. And I think this is one of the things that is not always appreciated. If you grow up in a system where there's a high degree of reciprocity, you're expected to maintain that. And when you break it down, you're seen as being violating those norms. So again, a lot, I lived and worked a long time in Jamaica. Was it corrupt for me um, to sort of be able to get my children into the school I wanted to get them into in return for telling the principal that, when their daughter is ready to go to university, come and see me? It probably was corrupt, but I mean, that's just how life works in these, and it functions fairly well. It doesn't necessarily mean that good people aren't getting ahead, but you get ahead by using a slightly different rule book.
That's very interesting, very insightful indeed, John. I'm going to flip it. So we've talked a little bit about the global south or developing countries and some of the issues there. And you've alluded to this already. In the West, people feel that their standard of living is slipping. Yes, they recognize that on the average it is higher than the average person living in, say, Africa. Absolutely. But nonetheless, people are interested in the relative for them and their neighbours and how they felt the year before and the decade before, not how people in a disparate country feel, rightly or wrongly. Do you think, to cut to the chase, do you think the West in general, or you could pick certain countries, are inevitably or likely to be heading for recession?
Yes, is the short answer. I think so. I think and I think the other thing I think, Lewis, I also would suggest is that I think we have to nuance our understanding of recession. We've been, ever since the invention of national accounts in the 1930s, we have been using aggregate measures of when is an economy in expansion and when is it in recession. But I think if you have an economy, and I think the US is really right now the classic illustration of this. You have an economy which is growing healthily, but which for many and possibly most of the population feels like a recession because it is a recession. Their incomes are not growing as fast as prices are rising. They're being asked to work longer hours. Their standard of living is declining. House prices are going up. They can't afford them. And to be told, well, the aggregate data is very clear, the economy is doing very well, is simply not going to satisfy them, nor should it. So I think I would say, for example, the U.S. there are two economies in the U.S. I mean, it's been called Schrodinger's economy. There's the booming economy, which is connected to a very small segment, which is the emergence of artificial intelligence. The rest of the economy, for all intents and purposes, is in recession. And my expectation is that AI bubble will burst at some point, quite possibly next year. And when that happens, the whole economy will be in recession. In Europe, most economies, some are doing better than others, but by and large, the big economies are all bumping along close to recession. They're not in recession. But again, for a substantial share of the population, it will feel that way, particularly for young people, given countries where there's a housing affordability crisis. To be told that you can afford, airfares are much cheaper than they were 50 years ago, but good luck ever, trying to buy a house. This is an example of the way I think we need a more nuanced understanding of human development. Is because in economics we talk about substitutability. You can transfer across, so a dollar of utility in air travel is same to a dollar of utility in housing. And this is based on this sort of physical model where you have a bunch of atoms, and those atoms are dollars or pounds or euros, and therefore if your income has gone up, you have more utility, so on, you are therefore better off. But if in fact, and you can be told that across the board all these things are much cheaper than they were, which is true. We meet a much more varied diet, we have better healthcare, we have more entertainment options. But are those things perfectly substitutable with having your own house? And it's clear, it's becoming increasingly evident that for an awful lot of young people, these things are not complete compensation. Being able to have avocado on toast, and in a nice cafe is not actually a full compensation for being able to have your own home. And so there are ways in which I think we have to sort of approach this and say, actually, is this an economy which is working for people? And if it is working for people, which people? If it's not working for everyone, is it working only for a few? And what is emerging there? And I do think that's it. We live in a situation, a time in which I would say the economies of the West, particularly the US, are working well for asset owners. Asset owners, incidentally, would be I would include pensioners in that category because they are living off the returns of those assets, but is working less and less well for working people. And that means effectively younger people. And I think this is becoming a social and political crisis, because if you look at the polling evidence, the attitudes of young people across the West, they're becoming increasingly hostile to democracy and to market economies, for the simple reason they keep saying it's not working for me. And they're not entirely wrong, I think, unless we prejudice our conclusions in favor of finding that they are wrong by saying, well, we go back to this idea of perfect substitutability across goods.
I might come back to housing costs specifically in a little while. I get the impression from what you said that you don't think that generative AI or AI in general is going to come to our rescue economically.
I wouldn't go that far. What I would say is we don't yet have any evidence it will. And the argument, the hype around AI, that it's coming, there's going to be a transformative takeoff. We're not yet seeing it.
Well, John, would the evidence, so let me put this in if I can. So would the evidence not be, we can see anecdotally, if you like, that if we want to dig something out from the internet, perhaps a coherent argument about some disparate issues that would take a long time to Google, AI often does a good job of that. Yes, it can hallucinate. Yes, we can't be sure that it's right, but it can produce pictures for us if we want to show a picture of something or produce a diagram. It can be very effective at all sorts of things. In fact, the examples I've given would be considered very backward, simplistic examples for what one can now arguably do with AI. So we can see that in our own lives, it can be very efficient or appears to produce efficiencies. Moreover, I think it's the case, although I haven't looked at stats about this, that some employers are starting to employ less people because AI is taking over some of the work, which obviously means less people are employed. But in the past, the pattern has been that these companies, these industries become more efficient. And yes, some people lose their jobs, but new jobs are created. And overall, the economy, like the automation of weaving and all this sort of business, the economy becomes more efficient. So are those not two arguments to say that surely AI is producing efficiencies, and it's just a matter of time until downstream that presents as improvements in GDP, enhancements to the economy?
Well, okay, let me take the employment effects first. The evidence we have, and we have to separate the evidence we have from the anecdotes we're hearing when it comes to employment, because we're hearing an awful lot from, shall we say, interested parties, the tech bros, if you will, about how AI is going to wipe out jobs. And then they'll point and you see that's why the job market is slowing down. That's why the unemployment rate is rising. they're connecting two completely separate things. This is a complete, from what we can tell, this is just a correspondence, but it's not in any way, there's no relationship there. And the reason I say that is this. When you actually say, okay, well, let's go into the industries and look where AI is being adopted, what have been the employment effects? It's mixed, actually, surprisingly. It is certainly, in specific industries, particularly software development, coding is very much, it looks like that will, replace a lot of jobs. In other industries, it will have and is having absolutely no effect and probably never will have no effect. Martin Wolf, the FT correspondent, famously said, probably the safest job in the world is being a gardener. It's simply not. There's not going to be much impact from AI. Um, so we're not yet actually seeing, and in terms of productivity impacts, we have yet to see from the companies that have been most aggressively adopting AI, we've yet to see, that's not to say it won't happen, but we've yet to see substantial gains, measurable gains in productivity. And this brings up, to your first point, is the anecdotal evidence about the ways it makes things efficient. If you just think about your own internet searches, Lewis, and certainly, yes, I mean, it's kind of, now you can sort of type in a question and AI will give you an answer. But you will be aware from your own experience that that what that answer will enable you to do is it will help you to focus your thoughts and think, okay, this is what I need to look at. If you're actually taking the evidence that Gemini is giving you, which is going to be from some Reddit stream or will be some Facebook post, and if you're relying on that, the quality of your output is actually declining. And this is something that has actually been measured by a team of researchers in the US, and they came up, I think at Stanford it was, this notion of work slop, that in fact there is evidence where AI has been adopted most aggressively. Some of the companies doing it, they're actually increasing their labor demand because they need to do a lot of cleaning up. They need to find out, is this actually true? And stuff, if they just go and publish stuff, it ends up, legal firms which have ended up sort of having to incur expenses because they prepare legal briefs using AI that turn out to be based on hallucinations. The judge throws it out and imposes costs on them. And is this just the bugs being ironed out, or is there fundamentally, and this is where the debate continues. What I will say, I think about AI, which is only just now starting to get increasing attention, I think, and this is something in fact, I have an essay coming out in the next week or two in Unheard on this very topic, contrasting the Chinese and American approaches to AI. And I would say the Chinese, by and large, both the government and the businesses are going for what I would call an optimization strategy. The Americans are going for a maximization strategy. The Chinese approach, typified in DeepSeek, is you create something that's good enough, but the key thing is to get it into production now, embody it in technology, whether it's turnstiles that can use facial recognition, whether it's you go into a train in China and you don't need a ticket. It is using sort of eye scanning the to get your reservation and your seat assigned and everything like that. It's all done this way. So they're doing and they're having some success with this. The Americans are going for this different approach. They want to create artificial superintelligence, which is proving to be phenomenally expensive. And the fundamental problem, they say, okay, so we're delaying the real. We're not actually producing usable things at the same rate the Chinese are. But when we have this breakthrough, it's going to transform the economy and transform the world. We're going to have these super intelligent being who can completely take us to another dimension. Now, there's a great debate, as you know, among there's a technical debate in the field as to whether this artificial superintelligence is ever going to be possible. But there's an even more fundamental problem is, given that what we know about the enormous energy demands that this artificial superintelligence is creating, what good is an artificial superintelligence, a superintelligent being that could enslave us and and turn us into just sort of taking marching orders from a machine? What good is it if you can destroy it by simply pulling its plug? I mean, this is the big difference. I mean, put it in simple terms, the great thing about humans is that, okay, so compared to the kind of computational work that artificial intelligence can do, we are much slower, but we're phenomenally more efficient. So it's going to take us much longer to do the task, but we can do it basically working all day with a glass of water and a cheese sandwich if we must. Our power demands are very slight. And the power demands of artificial intelligence on the American model are proving to be so great, it's not clear they'll ever be able to reach it, because the additional power they'll have to produce is beyond anything that they're projecting and anything they're investing in. In fact, I think the strongest argument for what's going to burst the AI bubble is that they are contracting to build data centers. And they are not contracting. There simply isn't the contracts for the electricity supply. Or if it comes on stream, and this is what's already happening in the United States, it's sucking up so much of the available electricity, it's pricing everybody else out of the market. So other industries are going to the wall, all to feed this ravenous AI machine. So I
That
think
sounds like Skynet.
yeah, a bit. Yeah,
From
yeah,
it really does
yeah,
sound
yeah,
apocalyptic.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so no, this is fascinating. So there are multiple reasons actually why we might see a sort of plateauing of AI. We might not, but we might see quite an abrupt plateauing of AI's ability. It could be that we can't iron out the wrinkles, that it's too energy costly. Um, Okay, so I want to move on from AI because I've got a lot of other questions for you. That's such a fascinating area. So we see a lot of tech companies obviously heavily invested in AI. That may go somewhere, that may not. Other ways that Western countries might be able to break themselves from the supposed malaise they're in. Now, as you point out, in some ways they are, and in some ways they aren't. In some ways, the GDP numbers and so forth suggest that maybe we're still progressing in the right direction. But for the regular man on the street, particularly in a place like London where I'm based, they can't afford a place to buy. They can barely afford the rent, so they've got very little expendable cash at the end of the day. And again, I'm going to come back to this in a little while. But another thing that's on the table, this is a UK specific issue, is going closer to the EU. And this was mentioned because this is just made it back into the news. The current government here seems to be making perhaps progressively more noises that it wants to move closer to the EU. And of course, famously, infamously, who knows, nearly 10 years ago now, the UK en masse voted just about to distance itself from the EU. Okay. So, John, what are your thoughts on whether closer ties to the EU, and of course, these could take various forms, closer ties to the EU is long term a good idea for the UK or not?
Oh, closer ties to the EU, Lewis, I would say, are inevitable. I mean, there's simply no way the economy is going to be able to revive itself to the degree of dynamism any of its leaders want and its citizens demand without that. And that just comes down to one of the most successful, I think, in economics, there's a great deal of debate among different schools, but there's a model called the gravity theory, the gravity model of trade, which I think is almost universally accepted, which is that when you will tend to trade more with the countries which are closest to you. It's simply, simple geography does matter. Britain cut itself off from its by far biggest market, a market that was relatively inexpensive to access, in order to pursue the possibility of trade ties with distant countries. And it simply defied logic that this would ever work. I don't take the view, which is a minority view, but the minority view is that, well, it was the right idea badly done. I think it was just not feasible. It would be rather like a country like Canada, where I mentioned I grew up, saying we're going to completely decouple from the American economy and trade with the rest of the world. Well, incomes in Canada would go down. I mean, it's simply so much more expensive to trade with the rest of the world than it is to trade when you drive a truck, a lorry across the 60 miles across the border, and you're reaching a huge market. So that is inevitable that Britain will have to one day rejoin the EU, unless its citizens can be persuaded to accept a lower standard of living. But most of the people who voted for Brexit, as far as I can tell, weren't doing it for purely cultural reasons. They really were sold on this idea that they'd be better off, that there'd be money coming for the NHS and the rest of it.
Well,
And
let me
that
push
hasn't
back if
been.
I can, just for the sake of argument, for the sake of conversation, I should say. I mean, actually, of course, there is a huge amount more money going into the NHS than was ever even promised by the powers that be at the time. Now, whether that's worked is another matter, but in terms of the actual amount going in, it's off the scale compared to what it was in 2015. Um, I guess people or at least the politicians who pushed for Brexit would say it's a long term, well, you've mentioned this already, it's a long term goal to pivot towards, Asia, where there looks like there's going to be long-term growth. These are up and coming countries. The 21st century is going to be broadly Asia and probably still the US. That Europe is an ever declining part of the world economy. That the UK is very much a service sector country. In other words, a lot of a lot of what it sells is through services rather than through goods. You can sell services around the world remotely, obviously through the internet and so forth. Yes, there is a gravitational effect but that progressively becomes less over time as technology improves. And so, of course, what Britain, of course, would like to have, and I think this was the phrase used at the time, was to have its cake and eat it, which is to have great close ties with the EU where it doesn't have tariffs, and that it shouldn't put up tariffs against the EU, and it's down to the EU if it wants to put up tariffs to the UK, whilst at the same time it can pivot to, in part, previous colonies, which is perhaps a slightly odd way of putting it, but of course, Britain has very strong ties with India, Malaysia, South Africa, etc., etc. I think that's a sort of broad argument, rather clunkily put by me, but that would be said in counter to your statement.
And I mean, the statement about the future of the EU is correct. It is, as a share of the world economy, as is Britain's, it is declining. It will continue to decline. It doesn't show any particular dynamism in the aggregate, although there are parts of the European Union which are quite dynamic. But the Nordic countries, Spain, interestingly, Portugal, the previous laggards have become the winners, and the previous winners, like Germany, are
Mm.
in a bit of a mess. Um, Having said that, I mean, I think it was a false dichotomy to say, well, it's Europe or Asia. There's so much more. There's no question. There's so much more on offer in Asia. Here's the difficulty, Lewis, is that in trade negotiations, there's two things. First of all, scale counts. Uh, it, I think there was a big mistake made by some of the more ardent proponents of Brexit that these former colonies would be keen to restore ties. And we're seeing how the Canadians, how the Indians negotiate. They drive an extremely hard bargain, and they also benefit from the fact that Britain has less to offer than the European Union as a whole. So it is able, these countries in their trade negotiations are able to drive an even harder bargain than they did when Britain was part of the European Union. The second thing that has to be said is there aren't many things the European Union does well, but they are good at trade negotiation. They're
Well, they're
very good
slow.
at that. They're
They're slow.
slow, but they're
So they have a
very,
trade deal with Canada. I think, is that right? You'd know they don't have a trade deal with India.
no, no, but then not many countries do. The Indians are very difficult to engage, and the Indians drive an extraordinarily hard bargain, and they are prepared to hold out because they're not a trade dependent economy. And so therefore they're quite happy to bide their time. The others, and of course, part of the, you know, it was so clear that Britain wanted and needed trade ties after Brexit, and the Indian government used that to its advantage. It was, well, you want this more than we're not asking, so what are you going to give us to make it happen? So I think there was a naivete in how this was going to be implemented. There wasn't a really carefully thought through strategic vision of how are we going to engage with the world and just what will they give us. And I think that has come home to roost in a very big way. Um, and funnily enough, Britain has a Britain has a basic problem, and it's a very difficult problem to solve, which is that its most dynamic industry for quite a long time has been high finance. And high finance has been badly hurt by Brexit. Now, in some ways, you could say hurting London is good for the rest of the country. You can actually make that case that there is a leveling London down is not necessarily bad for the rest of the economy, but it is in the aggregate. It's going to reduce your overall rate of growth, and most importantly, it's going to reduce your productivity because it's a very high productive economy, which had lost access to what was, a very large market. It's hard to say where things would have gone had Britain stayed in the European Union, but the Europeans are feeling intense pressure to, for example, unify their markets, and that was where Britain had the biggest edge. London was by far the biggest financial capital. It could have become potentially. I don't know if it would have, but if Europe is to have a market integration in the financial sector, and were Britain would become the natural epicenter just because of the gravity it had at the time. Hasn't lost it altogether, but it's lost an awful lot of its global ranking, and it's fallen as a result of that. It doesn't play the role it once did in the world economy. That's not to say it won't come back, but and as I say, it's not to say that the rest of the country will benefit. But it does in the aggregate from GDP growth and the tax revenue that comes in. But this brings us back to the earlier discussion, simply saying that the economy will grow fast. And I think that's a point that I will concede on the Brexit debate, but wasn't part of the campaign for Brexit. Was you can make a legitimate case that Britain will take a hit to its material standard of living in pursuit of goals which we believe will improve life for British people. That argument could have been made. It was not. We were told we would have our cake and eat it. And the choice was have your cake or eat it.
I think you're right. And I think you make a really good point. I do remember once, how I remember this, I don't know, perhaps because it was a controversial point. I remember once Nigel Farage, who was, of course, at the forefront of the Brexit campaign or one of the Brexit campaigns. And I think once he said words to the effect of, if we take a bit of a hit economically, and I think he would have stressed a bit, and maybe there's been more, maybe there hasn't, okay, that is worth the trade-off for, sovereignty was the other point. They wanted control of what the country does from within Britain. So this idea of sovereignty. And also, of course, a big issue was, levels of immigration. I think once he did go as far to say that there was some trade-off worth having there. That's his opinion. I also suspect that some part of the populace thought, well, we might take a hit here because we're leaving the common market, but we want control. Now, again, whether that's worth the trade-off and whether that's worked out is very debatable. But I think some people felt that. I mean, because one of the problems with these things is you've got a population of, let's say, 30 million people who can vote, or 35, 40 million people who could vote. And of course, they will all have their own opinion on why they're voting. And actually, one of the mistakes is to assume that we know why people voted. Of course, it's a hell of a mishmash. But okay, so if if it's unclear that AI is going to get the West out of the rut that it's arguably in, it is unclear that Britain's not going to rejoin the EU anytime soon, although it may start to join bits of it over time through the present government, perhaps. So, okay, that's not, let's say, an immediate or quick or obvious solution for Britain to get out of its rut. What does Britain need to do to turn its fortunes around, if indeed it can at all?
Well, what I would say, and this is going to sound very, odd perhaps, but the fundamental problem that not just Britain, but most Western countries have, and I'll explain what I mean by this, is that they become too rich. Now, what do I mean by they become too rich? I mean that the value of assets is rising much faster than income, and has been over the last, well, really since the turn of the millennium, but particularly since the financial crisis in 2008, that central banks resorted to the strategy of flooding the economy with money through ultra loose monetary policies, so interest rates that are zero or negative in some cases, where you're actually the government is, or the central bank is literally paying you to borrow money, and that inflated asset values. And they said, well, that's what kept us from going into a depression. The problem is that asset values have risen so fast, and an awful lot of it is actually going into unproductive capital, namely the form of real estate. There's a lot of property speculation. The house prices has risen, and as house prices have risen, so have rents on all properties. Just to give you a simple anecdotal illustration of what impact this has. In my neighborhood, there's a lovely bookstore, independent bookstore, which was set up by a former journalist who left her career when she was in her 30s just because she loved books. And she said, I just want to set up a bookstore and a cafe. And she set up this little bookstore and a cafe, and it's doing very well. This is something that is simply impossible in London. The only 30-something-year-old who could set up an independent bookstore in London today would be some kind of Nepo baby who has a huge inheritance and can buy the property and do it as a hobby. But nobody's going to be able to do it as a viable business because the rents they have to pay on that bookstore are so extortionate that the rate of new business formation therefore suffers. There's much less innovation entrepreneurship. You graduate from university, nobody is going to, or not nobody, but few people are going to seriously give thought to entrepreneurship, to trying their hand at business, because they have this huge debt to carry and they're expected to find a job and do it. And so that disincentivizes new business creation, which slows the economy and of course means that a higher share of income is going to pay rents, whether you're a tenant or whether you're buying your first house. And the money that you're not spending, therefore, in the economy or investing in more productive activities is inhibiting growth. So I actually think, and why have these economies become so rich in the aggregate? It's because asset values have been artificially inflated by both central bank and government policies in order to protect asset owners. And that really has to do with the changing demographic composition of society. That back at the time of the Great Depression, less than 5% of the population was retired. The economy collapsed, but it also meant that when it did resume growing, it grew at rates of 6, 7, 8%. Today, after a great crash, I mean, the central banks boast, well, nobody was wiped out. We sort of saved the economy, but the growth rate has more or less stagnated since, because there wasn't that sort of renewal within the economy. And that's because, in Western societies, it's now more like a fifth of the population is living off those assets, namely pensioners whose pension funds are, and if you actually allowed asset prices to find a floor that would be more sustainable over the long term for the economy, their standard of living would go down. And there isn't a politician. I mean, you look in Britain, I mean, you take something, every economist will tell you, and every politician off the record will say the triple lock on pensions is completely unsustainable. It will bankrupt Britain. But yet in the public statements, they're all committed to it. Why is
Well,
that?
pensioners vote. Pensioners vote.
Pensioners vote. And therefore we're kind of stuck in this now. Again, should somebody not be making the case to the pensioners, your children and grandchildren are going to be deprived of a future if we stay on this path? I think somebody should be making that case, because I think honestly, people show time and again they'll make sacrifices to be able to give their children and grandchildren a better future. But we are constantly stuck in this rhetoric, this cake and eat it. No, we don't have to make sacrifices. Well, we do. Young people made great sacrifices during the pandemic in order to, prevent the kind of destruction that would have happened to some of the more elderly population had we allowed the disease to run riot. And I think it's only fair to ask that sacrifices be made in return in order to put the country on a more sustainable growth path. That would mean that stop this business of every time you get a sharp, downturn in the stock market that the central bank rushes in with loose monetary policy and the government rushes in with bailouts. Allow these firms to be wiped out, allow the asset prices to fall. Yes, some people are going to end up being worse off, but it also means for a first-time home buyer, you're going to have a lot more income left over for other purposes.
Can you just briefly explain how central banks are able to keep asset prices high?
Simply because it's the most basic rule in economics, Lewis, which is that the value of money is essentially today. I mean, there was a time when money, cash, fiat currency, as we call it, was backed by some kind of hard asset. In Britain, it was, for a long time, it was silver. That's why we call it the pound sterling. It is, at one time, it was what, you bought a pound of sterling silver with a pound. Then it became the gold standard, that you would be able to exchange your pounds. And so that essentially, and that was one of the things which was said to have caused the Great Depression, because what happened is when The economy went into recession in the 1930s because Britain was on the gold standard, and it was having to use its gold to pay for any imports that were coming into the country. Its gold reserves were going down, which meant it had to reduce the supply of money, which meant there was less money in circulation. So economists came up with this clever idea, which was, no, you shouldn't actually, you should allow the supply of money to be regulated by a central bank, because during a recession, when everything is, has gone kaput, you actually want to, as Keynes famously said, you want to just basically get money into people's pockets so they get out spending again. So it was a good theory. The problem is, what happened is, with the collapse in the property market that happened in 2008, and what was seen as being the political disruptions that would result, there were two things which happened simultaneously. Central banks greatly increased the money supply by cutting interest rates, because when you cut interest rates, especially when you cut them to zero, when it costs absolutely nothing to borrow money, well, then you just will borrow unlimited credit. You can get a huge amount of money into the economy. It was not, however, getting into the hands of consumers. It was not getting into the hands of businesses. It was getting into the hands of existing asset owners, because they're the ones whose banks would actually allow them to take on a lot of debt. And they were using it to, as I say, to speculate on property. That was a big part of it. And meanwhile, governments this was the period of austerity. It's the very period. I mean, it would have made sense had the central bank cut interest rates on government debt, so the government could then use that money to stimulate the economy. They didn't. They did it to use it to cut spending, to thereby cut taxes, and again, that tended to benefit the better off, but the economy as a whole, and we're paying the price for that austerity to this day across Western countries, and deteriorated infrastructure, deteriorated public services. But by increasing the supply of money much faster than you increase the supply of goods, services, and assets, you just cause it to be bid up. So, you might say there's £1 trillion of money in circulation. Well, we'll double that, or we'll triple that, or we'll quadruple it. And the increases were phenomenal. And therefore, there's just so much more money available. And so that means that property prices were going up in some countries in double digits in some years. Far in excess of the growth of the economy. So you're shifting resources, you're shifting money from the working population to the asset owning population, to the rent earning population. That's how it happens. Does that make sense?
It does
Is that
make sense.
understandable?
It is. That's beautifully explained, John. So you would argue that after the great financial crash of 2007, 2008, that the so-called austerity in the UK and many other countries, in other words, this attempt to cut back on government spending to reduce the country's overall debt, having bailed out the banks, you feel that was broadly the wrong approach. And you would call it, because a lot of people would say, well, it's not austerity because these governments were typically still spending more year on year than the country was making. It's just that the deficit was smaller than it used to be. So it wasn't really austerity because we're still overspending. But you might say it was austerity because actually there was the opportunity there to borrow money at a very, very low rate and invest it so that the country would grow and to some degree grow its way out of the debt.
Right. Yeah, that's what should have happened. They should have actually, because one of the things that isn't sufficiently appreciated, private debt and public debt tend to vary in inverse proportions. So when the government cuts its spending and thereby cuts its deficit, you tend to find, because credit is cheap and abundant, the private sector debt goes up. So the aggregate level of indebtedness in Western countries has just gone up and up and up. It's just the government share has gone down. But the problem is in the private share, it's going increasingly towards unproductive investments, particularly real estate. And the problem with real estate is that it doesn't generate profit. In economic terms, it generates rent. How do you make as you're a property owner, how do you increase your income from that property? Well, you want to ensure that property remains scarce. So the value of your property goes up, and you have not just one person asking to rent your place, you have 3 or 4. So you can play them off against each other and inflate the rents until you get the highest bidder. And so there's a sort of a vested interest which prevents property development, so-called NIMBYism. Whereas had the governments invested it, to whether it's to build high-speed rail, to build housing, um, to build, and to build, to accelerate the energy transition in order to get cheap electricity available in British homes and to British businesses. That would have done properly, been able to crowd in the private investment, which would have been feasible for those with a vision, and it would have discouraged the kind of speculation on fixed assets that happened as a result, which went mainly into real estate. And it's as one lecture, when I was in Cambridge, my college had an annual lecture series, and we had a very interesting 1 year lecture by Adair Turner, and he called it locationally specific real estate, which is to say it wasn't just across the board by real estate anywhere you could find it. It was in the more, particularly in London. It was in the inner boroughs of London where, the supply simply could not be increased. And so prices just got bid up and up and up and up. And that's been deleterious for the economy because the working population has to now commute from great distances, which affects their own productivity. And of course, a lot of the property lies, no small amount of property in London lies vacant much of the time because it's owned by foreign owners who are buying it as an asset and using it as a store of money,
Is
knowing
that
that
still
its
happening?
value will go up. And less so, but it was certainly a
Less.
big thing.
So how do you fix the so in London it comes up as sort of level 9, I think, on some ranking of how unaffordable housing is. I can't remember the metric now, but basically London house prices have now hit this level, as I think is the case, for example, in Vancouver probably and places like this, where it's deemed to be basically impossible, more or less impossible for the regular person to purchase a property in London. That's a broad brush metric, of course, but it's got ridiculous. How does one fix that? Particularly a place like London is already quite heavily built. I mean, you're not going to build on the royal parks, for example. What does one do to try and bring those prices down?
No, you couldn't build in. There are certainly neighborhoods where you couldn't add supply, but there are places you could that are very, are not central London, but are close enough in that you can, the population has access, so there's discussions about is the green belt actually necessary? These sort of discussions which come up, and I'm not really versed to contribute to that because then you touch upon more than just economic issues. But I think you can certainly say, and I think one of the things that I think a real opportunity that was missed during the pandemic is during the initial lockdown, when everyone was told to work from home, there was this period when many Londoners sort of took advantage of the cheap property that was available in Yorkshire or in Shropshire and said, well, I'll work from home. And but as soon as the lockdowns were over, the government put intense pressure on getting civil servants back to the office. And I think that was a missed opportunity. I think they should have allowed those people to stay because that would have led to a revival in villages. There was no particular, the main reason I could tell why governments, the politicians were so eager to get people back into the office is because it was affecting the value of commercial property in London. And
Mm.
commercial property owners are big contributors to political parties in Britain. But I think for the economy as a whole, that sort of experiment in remote working, which was from what most of the research I've seen on the productivity impacts was actually a fairly successful experiment, would have been a way to level up quickly and easily. And you would,
So
of course,
corruption got in the
facilitate.
way. In this case, corruption got in the way.
I suspect it
Maybe.
was, call it that,
I
yeah.
think I think Margate, which is on the south coast, I think that's having somewhat of a revival. So these, we all know the kind of classic case study of the English coastal towns that until the 1960s were doing reasonably well for themselves. There'd been the places that the middle class Victorians went back in the day as you started to get an expanding middle class in the United Kingdom as a very rich country back then. And so these places have very nice facades and lots of interesting historical aspects to them. But then once you get a cheap flight to the Algarve, people wanted to guarantee sun and whatever and exoticism. And so these seaside towns have collapsed. And some are maybe making a bit of a comeback now because you get those individuals who are earning relatively decent wage in London and perhaps other cities, Manchester, Greater Manchester, and so forth, who now are able to work from home at least for part of the week, and so have shot off to the coast and are prepared to take a train in once a week or once a fortnight for that team meeting. So
Mm-hmm.
there's an element of it, I suspect, but as your point is, it could have been it could have been so much. It could have been so much more. So, last couple of questions for you, John. Then I'll let you get on with hopefully a fun Christmas. Um, Parties on the right of centre at the moment in the UK, which I guess are Reform and the Conservatives. There's also the SDP, whom I must mention because I had the pleasure of talking to their leader, William Clouston, not too long ago, who's a very impressive individual. But anyway, so those parties, I think they would argue that if they could get into power, this is how they would turn things around. I made a short list. I no doubt it's not definitive, but broadly speaking, build not just houses, but build infrastructure, because as I understand it, Britain is particularly bad at actually getting on and actually building. Yes, Western economies in particular have a lot of red tape, a lot of health and safety, and we can debate the value of that and how far we should go with those things. But it does seem Britain is particularly ossified in that respect. Um, Drill in the UK. So, rightly or wrongly, drill for oil and indeed frack, because there's a lot of Britain is very fortunate in having a lot of natural resources still, despite having worked very hard at consuming its natural resources, because of course it was the start of the industrial revolution, and yet still there are relatively high levels of natural resources. So build, drill, again, for better or for worse, scrap net zero, and of course that could have big implications down the line, but that would be an argument for now. Get people off welfare, as the phrase goes. So there's an argument to say if we could return levels of welfare back to the pre-COVID level, so not very long ago. Again, a controversial point, of course, but that would greatly help. Potentially pivot to a different model of higher education. Have more apprenticeships, more vocational training, and make that more, give it greater levels of societal kudos, and to automate. So not necessarily through AI, but this slightly clunky phrase of roboticization, that the UK is relatively unroboticized for a Western country. Now, I don't think that's a definitive list, but these are the sort of the vibes. These are the ideas I hear coming from, slowly but surely, the Tory party, and very rapidly bleated out by the Reform party, whether they're right or wrong. What say you to that list of ideas of how to rejuvenate the UK?
So building, yes, unquestionably. There's just, if it would take radical reform. I mean, I think, interestingly, I think one of the very few things, I was not a fan at all of the Boris Johnson government, but I think they actually had a good idea. One of the few things I think Dominic Cummings was sensible about was this idea of automating planning approval, to shift the onus away from councils. In other words, planning goes from being guilty till proved innocent to being innocent till proved guilty, new house building. I think that was actually a good idea. And I think that was a missed opportunity. And I think something like that would be good. Drill, far more skeptical. The reason being that if you look at the future growth of demand in the world economy for energy is going to be coming, 80% of it is going to be coming from the developing world. And the developing world is proceeding towards its energy transition very rapidly. It's doing so for a couple of reasons. One is that it's become very efficient, it's very inexpensive. But secondly, very importantly, there is an abundance of natural energy resources. And you take Africa, sunlight alone. I mean, you can completely eliminate a country's import dependence on fuel, and which means that you have a regularity, you have energy sovereignty. So there's a strong incentive, and China is quite happy to meet that demand. And therefore, I think the fossil fuel industry, even if it might have a short-term future, long-term, it would be a lot of sunk capital. I think that would be a mistake. Now, you can make a case that Britain specifically, because it doesn't have the same degree, certainly of sunlight, it's one of the few countries in the world that really doesn't benefit from itself trying to go towards renewable energy. But if you're trying to build an energy industry, you really do need exports. And I don't think that long-term demand is going to be there. You just have to look at the fact that, an ounce of silver is now worth more than a barrel of oil. Silver is up over 100% over the last year because of this increase in money supply. Oil hasn't budged. That itself is a warning sign that it should be going up along with other commodities. It isn't. And that suggests that the future demand is simply not materializing in spite of the geopolitical, you know, 40 years ago, massing an armada off the coast of Venezuela would have sent oil prices, through the roof. It's had no impact. They're still falling. Getting people off welfare, this is another case where I think rather with corruption, I think in Britain we have tended to over moralize this discussion. And I think we need to be far more pragmatic in our approach to welfare. For example, there's this sense that idleness is sort of doing the devil's work. If somebody is on welfare, that's morally somehow corrupting. And therefore, the most important thing is to get them into work. Now, if that's stacking shelves, no shame in that, let them stack shelves. But if somebody has invested 3 or 4 years of their life, obtained a university degree in art history or something like that, and then you have them stacking shelves, that's an actually really inefficient use of their time and of the nation's money to educate that person to do something they didn't need to go to university for. And there is a tendency to do that rather than saying, well, let that person volunteer in an art museum until the right job comes along so they continue to develop their human capital. It'll impose a cost in the short term, but in the long run, we're going to be better off. Which is, I think, the real problem in Britain is not that there are too many people on welfare. It is that the welfare is very inefficiently administered because there is this, and it's the same approach that the assumption is if you have a disability, you're probably a skiver, and therefore we're going to, whatever work you can take, we'll take. And it could be that there is a job that would be far more productive. You can do only 10 or 12 hours a week, but because that's all your medical condition allows you to, but you're pressed into some kind of labor intensive job for 20 or 30 hours a week. That is wasting public resources and private resources too. So I think the whole approach that's being led by virtually all parties in Britain, but certainly the right-wing ones on welfare is, I think, excessively moralistic rather than pragmatic. And I think we need to be pragmatic about this. Automation, certainly, I think there is a lot of possibility there, and certainly the public sector, where productivity is very poor. I mean, the difficulty is it's a lot more difficult to do than it sounds. For example, I think this is something that has become a real problem in the NHS. I mean, it got a woefully outdated digital infrastructure. There's so much is still kept in files that are written down, and so much could be accomplished by digitalizing it. The problem is, and consultants are called in to advise on how to digitalize, the technology being used is so outdated, they don't even have the people who actually learned how to use this technology are all in their 70s or older. I mean, it's ancient. And they would have to actually completely reinvent the wheel, as it were, and start from scratch. It's not simply a question of saying, take the existing technology and put it in, because they don't even know how to transfer some of the file formats into the existing formats. So it is, government after government comes in with with good intentions, and they're bedeviled by the fact that Britain has allowed itself to get so far behind. Finally, as far as higher education goes, I think that higher education in Britain is one of the most successful export industries the country has developed. Britain punches well above its weight in international, standings. I mean, for a country of this size to have, there's a long list of universities in the top, global top 20. And I think it's been governments in the last few years have been very short-sighted on this whole approach to the question of student visas. And rather than seeing foreign students as an asset, seeing them as a drain on the system, particularly when they bring families. But of course, a lot of the students bringing families in will be graduate students who have started families, started households, potentially the people who will sort of go on to take positions in your economy. And when you sort of disincentivize them coming to Britain and they go elsewhere. I mean, if you look at a country like Canada, I think it's a far more enlightened policy on this, really encourages students to come in, to stay, to do as many degrees as they can, and then join the workforce. And And that means that you're sort of selecting for talent rather than almost sort of saying, again, I think a sort of moralistic approach that, well, these students coming in, because there is some gaming of the system that does exist. But you know, the assumption that somehow they're a drain on the economy and their families are a drain, I think it needs, again, a more nuanced approach to say, well, when are those students are an asset, and when do we want to encourage them coming to Britain? Because that is export revenue. If they're paying, coming in and paying fees, that is the export
And they pay a
revenue.
lot of
I think
fees. They
this,
pay a lot of
they
fees.
pay a
Here's
lot
an
of
interesting,
fees.
just to jump in on that just briefly, actually, here's an interesting camp that I never hear said, and maybe it's because I'm getting this wrong. Is there not a risk of a kind of what one might call a neo-colonialism in that a country like Canada or Britain might say, oh, we're going to attract the brightest and the best from some developing countries. Isn't that wonderful for us? They're ever so capable. They've already trained to a high level. They're clearly smart people. Their kids are going to be great too because, you know, all that sort of business. The family members breed, you know, good family members and so on down the generations. Well, that's great for Britain and Canada. But are we potentially, you know, taking the brightest and the best from countries that can ill afford to lose their brightest and best? So we push
It
ourselves up and push other countries down.
it depends. It depends. It can, and I think one of the ways this has been, you know, for example, the South African medical, the public health system has been decimated by the recruitment policies of the NHS of Canada. Canada in
Oh,
particular
mm,
has, you know, in other words, you know, a poor country taxes itself quite considerably to educate its young people who then go off and develop
right.
another economy. Now, the solution to that, you know, at one time in my life, I ran a think tank that was based in Jamaica, Barbados, and London. It was a Caribbean think tank, and we actually did some work on this. And I said that solution is indigenous to those countries. That the trick was, do not provide, essentially do the British approach, which is you pay the students' fees in full on graduation if they stay within the country of their
Yeah.
birth. You know, for as long as they're working, you continue. You know, in a sense, you build up a debt, but you pay their fees. If they leave the country, you then collect those fees as a full debt payment. So then they go off and they develop that other country. But the other thing to bear in mind is that countries can, done properly in their emigration policies as opposed to immigration policies, the developing countries can benefit from immigration because if you look at, for example, the Indian software industry, it's benefited immensely from Indians who've gone, established themselves in Silicon Valley in California, and then themselves, because of the networks they have back in India, can say to their employer, look, we're hiring somebody here to do this job. I have colleagues back in Bangalore who can do it for a quarter of the price if you would allow me to sort of manage this particular portfolio for you. And so there's a lot of backward linkages which can be created.
Mhm, mhm.
So done properly, this can be a win-win. It's not often done properly, or it's not always done properly. But some countries have a more enlightened approach than others. And I think, as I say, a lot of the solution to that, to brain drain, is within the developing countries themselves. They can profit off this. They can say, well, look, you know, there's a growth industry creating training doctors for Britain. Let us turn that into an export earner rather than a net drain,
I
rather as
agree. I
Britain
agree.
desires
There's
to.
just you're right. I mean, everything you say is right. There's a balance between we'd like the money coming in, but if you lose too many of your best and brightest, well-educated, then it can work against you, I would imagine. But I take your point. It's about getting the balance right, as these things so often are. But yeah, winding down. But you're an author, John, of no less than 5 books. Your most recent one, I think this is right, is Why Empires Fall. Um, Actually, the question I've got about that is, I noticed for that book that you're a co-author. So there's 2 authors. There's you and is it Dr. Heather from memory?
Yeah, Peter Heather. Yeah.
Peter Heather. How does one co-author a book? So what I mean by that is that if one's writing a book just oneself as the only author, you know, you chip away at it, maybe a chapter at a time and whatever. What do you do when you're going to write a book with someone? In one sense, it seems like a lovely idea and you collaborate with someone and you motivate each other, maybe. But how do you get it to intertwine? How do you get it to mesh in the end?
Well, I guess there's two ways to do it. How do you do it and how do you do it well? I mean, one would think that okay, co-author it means it's half the work. You know, so that's brilliant. But if it's done well, it ends up being more than twice the work. And the reason is the way Peter and I did it is when we initially set out to, it was an iterative process. We would each sort of take a section, which drew upon our specialty, write the first draft, then pass it to the other to sort of say, okay, rewrite this, bringing in your section and then showing what works, what doesn't, which entailed an awful lot of conversation, talking through, coming to an understanding. What are the things that really matter? What didn't? In antiquity, this seemed to matter. It doesn't seem to matter in the modern period. Why is that? Were we looking at the wrong thing in antiquity? Were we looking at the wrong thing today? So this, and then we'd end up writing and rewriting until gradually what emerged was this sort of narrative where I think, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions or passages which really draw upon one of our expertise over the other, I think the book reads fairly seamlessly. I think that, it's not like you sort of say, oh, this chapter is clearly written by Heather, this one's clearly written by Rapley. There are very few chapters. There was only one chapter which was written by just one author. Everything else was co-authored through and through and through. And that included getting right down to the nitty-gritty of word choice and and metaphors to use or not use and disagreements like that. So it was a very lengthy process. From actual conception to completion was, oh goodness, it was more than 15 years.
Oh,
It was, it was one we came back to every once in a while. We weren't sure it was working. Went through several different sort of versions until we finally hit upon the right one. It's done very well. So I'm very pleased about that. You call it, as rightly, my most recent book, but very soon, my most recent book. I have a new book coming out in February, at the end of February. And it's called Icarus Economics. And it's on this very idea that as a country gets richer, its growth rate slows until ultimately it begins to actually eat into its wealth and go backwards. And, really dealing with the current state of Western economies and what needs to be done. So, and is a single authored book. So that's coming out in end of February. I'll be back
wonderful. I suppose
for that.
wonderful. Okay. But you don't yet have a sort of front cover of your book to flash up on the screen, I guess.
Flash up. Well, there is a front cover.
I shall find it. Will it be
Okay.
available on the internet to find?
Absolutely. Just say Rapley Icarus Economics, and it will come up. It's being published in Britain by Atlantic Books.
Wonderful. John, you're a font of knowledge, of course. You're highly experienced, an intellectual and a deep thinker. When I hear people like you talk about all these issues, I keep thinking, do you get the opportunity to speak to those people who are in power? I mean, do you have the ear at all of politicians? Is there anyone in positions of genuine power who listen to what you've got to say directly?
So when I ran my think tank, that was my job, essentially advising governments in the Caribbean. So, I spent quite a lot of time doing that. And that then brought me into interaction with, government ministers from other countries and, visiting delegations, what have you. So I did quite a lot of that. Um, at the moment, I've just opted to go entirely. I'm very fortunate in that, I earn enough now off my writing that I just write. I'm no longer, I left Cambridge a couple of years ago, and I'm just now living full time the writing life, which gives me the luxury of not having to try and gain an entree. And that's not to say people aren't reading me. I do, time to time I'll see a prominent politician will tweet something I've written or whatever. So I think I'm certainly being noticed, but whether or not, I wouldn't say I'm engaging in direct conversation of any sort at the moment. I don't spend any time at all in the halls of power in any of the major capitals, put that. And I don't seek to. I rather enjoy this kind of this life of the detached author who.
But I mean, if you got an email, if you no, you seem to have a wonderful lifestyle and all power to you, and you've earned it. If you got, hypothetically, or maybe not hypothetically, a letter or an email from Whitehall saying, we're convening a set of experts on, global economies or something, I don't know, and we want you to be part of this team, and we're going to have a number of discussions, and I presume that you would go, at least if they paid for your expenses. And I just wondered, I'm probably being extremely naive here, but I just wonder why governments don't do that more often, don't spend a decent amount. I suppose they're just very, very busy as part of the answer, but spend a lot of time speaking to the evident experts, not that they necessarily agree. And of course, you'd want a set of experts who disagree with each other in the room to talk things through, in my view. But why they don't do that more, make sure they're getting the best information available as they generate policy.
They do, and I've done my fair share of that over the years. I've been invited to many sort of confabs in very salubrious settings, which I enjoyed greatly, when it happened. I think one of the things I would sort of say is one of the things I did really gain an appreciation for when I was running my think tank is that politics is something which has got a very bad name of late. They've sort of the view of politicians is they're either on the take, they're corrupt, they're lazy, they're entitled, whatever, or the least talented. Politics is a vocation, as a famous essay by Max Weber which was written over a century ago. And it's an underappreciated, to do it well is an underappreciated skill. Many times I would be in meetings where, a famous economist would be advising a prime minister, and the prime minister would listen. And the prime minister, who might only have a bachelor's degree, no economics education, would say that will never work. And the economist would say, well, it will work. Look at this model. It's tested. We've empirically validated it. And he says, you go and talk to the people I talk to when I go on the hustings. That will never work. And they're right. They have an intuitive sense, which is very important. I think the reason I'm saying this now, Lewis, is because I think academics sometimes, particularly those who haven't spent time in either the business world or in government, have an inflated view of what they can accomplish simply by giving advice. I think all we can do is, there is a role, an old friend of mine who now is a vice chancellor at a British university, but an old friend of mine from my Oxford days used to say, there's a role for the contemplative life, but those who live the contemplative life have to appreciate we don't actually run things. We can sort of say, this is what I think will work, but we have to have the humility to accept that however it's implemented, it will have to be adjusted to meet, contact with reality. So I think the frustration I hear often from colleagues who don't get asked for advice is, I know the solution. And I say, well, you think you do. But sometimes the reason you're not getting asked for advice is because they actually know you don't know the solution. And I think we need to approach that with a certain humility. I think this is important. I feel very strongly academics need to basically get out into the world a lot more than they do. There's a temptation to sort of circulate mainly among other academics. And some of the lessons I learned, particularly because I have lived and worked much of my life in the developing world, and so in environments where I'd be encountering, in some cases, illiterate people, but who were very wise, in rural communities, for example, there's a lot to be learned from experience. And politicians do acquire that in a way that academics don't. And so I think that offering service is one thing, but I do think it has to be done with humility.
We'll end there, John. Thank you so much. Where can people find more John?
Just Google me. I'm on the internet now, and I publish regularly in a number of different publications, so I don't think they'll have any difficulty finding me. And if they go on to the websites of those publications, my biographical details are there. So I'm very easy to reach, actually. I can't promise I respond to people's emails, as you can attest, Lewis, necessarily very promptly, because I do try to answer readers' emails by and large, for example, but I get a lot. And so I often end up piling them up until the holiday season. So in answer to your question of how fun will my holiday be, there will be fun, but there will be an awful lot of correspondence catching up on as well.
Well, I hope you can enjoy that and some Christmas cheer in between those
Oh, I will.
correspondences as well.
I will.
Indeed. John, thanks so much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure, Lewis. Thank you.